Good morning, everyone. My name's 𒒂💅💄💌. I'm the head of DevOps at Devo team. You just heard Mark talk about us. I want to first thank you. Thanks, Anne, for your talk. Thank you, Barry, for organizing this. I know it takes a lot of effort, and it's nice to be back on stage. So, the title of my talk today is Counting the Cost of the Not-So-Lean Enterprise. Let's get this clicker to work. It's not working. Oh. There we go. I prefer this title, Storage is Cheap. How many people have heard this expression, storage is cheap? I think it's common. I hear it all the time. Because we think storage is cheap, we don't really think about storage. But we should be thinking about it. Data center carbon emissions account for 3.6% of global emissions, and that number is rising as we build more and more data centers and as other sectors start decarbonizing. So this is an ethical issue, it's an environmental issue. Air travel accounts for 2% of our emissions, and it's getting a lot of scrutiny in the press. It's going to come with data storage and computing as well. This headline is from last week. The Security and Exchange Commission in America is going to have all public companies report on their carbon emissions. This is the global direction of travel. It's not going to be just public companies, it'll be private companies as well. And it includes the Scope 3 emissions, which is our purchasing of goods and services. So, making storage efficient is not a should-do anymore, it is a must-do. All companies are going to have to report on their carbon emissions, and the companies that have the lowest emissions are going to win in the next economy, in the coming economy. They're going to win reputationally because the public cares about this stuff, and they're going to care more in the future. So I've been working in IT for over 30 years, and what has been one of the most disturbing things I've found in working in my journey is the amount of waste in IT. The amount of waste with our computing infrastructure, with our computing tools. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. As we get more scale, more complexity, we are getting more and more wasteful. We're losing track of what we're doing. In terms of DevOps, a poorly maintained DevOps engine is wasteful, costly, and polluting. And they're the engine for our software development and our software delivery. But these tools are often underperforming, and it affects the productivity, it affects user experience, it affects attraction and attrition of our IT staff. And these tools are typically underfunded and undervalued. Ironically, it's despite the fact that they really are some of the most important parts of our IT infrastructure. So this is another reason why efficiency matters. I'm going to use the image of this warehouse, of this physical warehouse, to illustrate how we store things virtually. Now, if you think about in Ikea, in a warehouse, they're storing kitchens and bedrooms and dining rooms. In our IT world, we are storing wiki pages, Jira projects, code repos, CI/CD pipelines, artifacts, binary artifacts, telemetry, but more broadly, those are the sort of the DevOps tools, but more broadly, cloud resources, applications, processes, lots and lots of stuff we're storing. And the commonality with all of these things, it's very easy to get stuff into these warehouses. It's very easy to create Jira projects, wiki pages, etc. But once it's in these warehouses, it's almost impossible to get it out. Why? because a lot of companies have data retention policies. So financial services will typically have sort of 7-year data retention policies. If your data gets into a production system, it's got to stay there for 7 years. We don't know what's important necessarily, and the longer the stuff is in there, the less we know about it. Things that are there for 3, 4, 5 years, a lot of these people have left, so we don't actually even know what it is. And fundamentally, we're missing the tags and labels to tell us what this stuff, what we're storing. We don't know. So as a consequence of this, come on. I don't really know what's going on here with our clicker. Yeah, so as a consequence, the stores are getting bigger and bigger and bigger until we get the virtual equivalent of this. And this is a mess. We're storing lots of stuff that has no function. It's almost impossible to identify what this is. This is a study in enterprise inagility. So can you imagine if you went to Ikea, into their warehouse in their superstores, and you walked into to get your stuff, and 30–40% of the boxes had no labels on them. I mean, it wouldn't be a viable business. They would go bankrupt very quickly. And yet we do this all the time in our virtual warehouses. We store all kinds of stuff. We don't know what it is. And we often have one sort of frazzled contractor who's tasked with looking after our Jira instance or our Git repos. They don't have time to look in the top shelf and see what's in those boxes or someone scribbled some bit of writing. Or sometimes we'll outsource our DevOps tooling to a third party, and they're not incentivized, and they're not interested in cleaning up this mess. So the big difference between this messy warehouse and a virtual messy warehouse is that the virtual messy warehouse is consuming power, cooling, 24/7, and lots of it. And when you get tools like this that are such a mess, they become unupgradable. So I've recently been working with a company that has a Git repo that's 4 major versions out of date. It's got 50,000 code repositories in it. They tried in pre-production to upgrade this instance to a newer version, and it took 1 week. So can you imagine sending an email to your to your developer community and saying, sorry, we're upgrading our Git repo, you can't check in any code for a week. No one's going to do it, it's too embarrassing. So what do? I really don't know why this clicker's not working. So what do? We start again with an empty warehouse. We buy a new tool, and I've seen this happen many times. Our Jira instance is a mess. Well, let's go and get a new one. Let's start fresh with a new tool, a new code repository. So we end up with all of these tools, knowledge bases, where up to 80% of our content is out of date. We have Jira instances where full of dead projects, empty projects, stuff created years ago, no one knows what it is, all kinds of customization, and it ends up to be a terrible user experience for developers. We have Git repositories, as I mentioned, encumbered with all kinds of Hello World projects or prototypes from years and years ago, and they're just sitting there, clogging up your tools, creating a poor developer experience. A colleague of mine recently worked with a utility in the Midlands where they were lifting and shifting 200 applications into the cloud. As they were doing this, they discovered that 80 of those applications, so 40% of these applications, were not required. They were either superseded or not used. So we've got 40% of our application estate is unused. And I really don't think this is an outlier in our industry. I think this is a case in lots and lots of large companies. Cloud resources are exploding. Costs are going out of control. We have recently been working with a large software company. We had a couple guys in there to try and sort out their AWS estate because it was unsecure, it was a mess. In 1 year, we saved 80% on their AWS cost bills. And so cost is essentially a proxy for carbon emissions, or can be a proxy for carbon emissions. So we're in a situation where They're 80% of what they're doing is not needed. I want to use this example of artifact repositories where we store our binary artifacts, the stuff that we run on servers. These are two different banks. I've worked with both of them. I'm very familiar with both of their artifact repositories. The one on the left is a bank twice the size of the one on the right. It had a binary artifact repository that was 7 terabytes in size. And when we worked on this, I actually worked on it with Barry several years ago. When we worked on this, we knew even at 7 terabytes, there was a lot of junk in there. We could have probably cut the size in half. More recently, I've gone to another bank, and I started using their code repository, and it's 70 terabytes in size, a magnitude larger. It's a dumping ground for everything. They store all kinds of crap in there. There's entire websites backed up daily for years, and then, say, in 2020, the backups stop, but they're just sitting there. So what do we do with this stuff? Do we just leave it? There are continuous build servers pumping out artifacts on a daily basis into these code repositories, never getting cleaned up, really poorly maintained. I think it's just, it freezes if I don't move it enough. This is, no, we're at the beginning. Okay. So what do we do? As I said, typically what we do is we don't know what to do with all this stuff, so we just buy a new instance and start again. So how do we solve this problem? We should be making it harder to get stuff into these repos, and I'll talk, and we'll make it easier to get rid of stuff. So when I say make it harder, I don't mean make it harder to create a Jira project or a code repository. In fact, we should be making this stuff easier. Jira projects take about 15 minutes to create, but in most large enterprises, you'll take 2 days or sometimes weeks to get the project because of all the bureaucracy around it. So I don't mean making it harder to create this stuff, but making it harder to make it stick, to persist it. If things are being created as prototypes or Hello World projects, great, let developers create all this stuff, but then clean it up or put it in a sandbox, which is ring fenced and can be cleaned out. Tagging is essential. I'd argue that anything that doesn't have a tag that relates to an application or a product or a service doesn't really need to be there and should be cleaned up. Everything should be tagged, and not tagged to an individual person because people come and go, but tagged to an app or a service or a product. And then deleting stuff, we should have automated cleaning up so that we clean up stuff that's not used. If something's not used for 6 months, send an email, send a second email, send a third email. If no reply, then archive it or delete it. Things that we do really need but we don't use, put them in deep archive. And if it's not part of our production systems, throw it out. So, there we go. Okay, so this is what success looks like. A well-managed warehouse where everything is labeled, everything is neat and tidy, we know it can be removed, no matter how big or how small the warehouse is. So yes, storage is cheap, but smarter storage is cheaper, more productive, a better user experience, and most importantly, less polluting. So I don't believe there's probably a single company here that is making really efficient use of the way they store their data. And I think it's, getting to a net zero future is so important for all of us. And I just urge all of you to do this and to do whatever you can to improve the way we use our data storage facilities. So, and the companies that get this right will be the ones that win in the future. And on that note, I will say thank you.